Okay, take your Bibles and turn to Matthew chapter 17. See what I'm going to do, because I'm going to share my screen. And we're going to go to BibleWorks here. Can everybody see that?
Yeah.
Unless you have a question or something, go ahead and mute your feed. All right, Matthew 17 and verse 20, right in here. So the disciples in this section, in fact, let me do this. In this section, the disciples have been trying to cast out a spirit, and they haven't been able to do it. Jesus comes along, and in verse 17, he says, "Yeah, you unbelieving and rebellious generation, how long will I be with you? How long must I put up with you? Bring him here to me." Then Jesus rebuked the demon, and it came out of him. And from that moment, the boy was healed. Then the disciples approached Jesus privately and said, why couldn't we drive it out? And in verse 20, and I'm reading out of the Holman Christian here, it says, "Because of your little faith," he told them, "for I assure you, if you have faith," and then it's going to say the size of a mustard seed. The word size is not in the Greek text. So if you have faith as a mustard seed, you will tell this mountain, move from here to there, and it will move. Nothing will be impossible for you. So what I want to talk about today a little bit is faith, and specifically faithfulness. And one of the things, we were talking about this a little earlier, is that for a long time, we at STF have translated and taught faith, the word underlying faith there, which if I scroll down here, you'll be able to see it. There it is. You can see it kind of popped up there. That's pistis, faith, belief, trust. We've taught that word means trust. The problem with translating it as faith is that there's a lot of baggage with that word in English that doesn't exist in the Greek word itself. And so, we have taught and liked the word trust for a long time now as a translation. But somehow, I'm not really sure how this happened, we missed something very, very important about this word. If we look up, we're going to call this up again. Where'd it go? There it is. We're going to look this up. Oh, that was a mistake. That's not what I wanted. I wanted that. There we go. Okay. This is a group of lexicons I got in here, and I want to use this one, the BDAG. And the way lexicons and dictionaries work is that the editor of the dictionary, they'll put the different definitions of a particular word in the order in which they believe the most common usage is. So if you've got a word that, say, has 4 different meanings, typically what they're going to do is they're going to put the most common meaning first and the least common meaning last. So when we look up pistis, and BDAG is one of the best lexicons, a biblical Greek lexicon. And if we look at the different definitions, you can see they've got definition 1, definition 2. I got a whole bunch of different ones for definition 2. And I think there's a total of 3. They've got 3 different definitions, and each definition has subcategories. But you'll notice the first definition is that which evokes trust and faith, and they have 3 different flavors of that, if you will. And the first one is the state of being someone in whom confidence can be placed. Faithfulness, reliability, fidelity, and commitment. What the editors of the BDAG are telling us is that they believe that in the Bible, this is the most common usage of pistis, the most common meaning when the Greek word pistis is used. And so what we know now is that for instance, John in the REV went through some time ago, this was several years ago, went through the whole thing and translated every place where pistis appeared almost every single time as the word trust. And now we know, okay, no, there's a lot of places where faithfulness is a better translation. And so I want to share with you this, and I went off of it, so let me go back here. Matthew 17:20. This is one of the places. So we read in the Holman Christian, because of your little faith, pistis, he told them, for I assure you, if you have pistis as a mustard seed, you will tell this mountain, move from here to there, and it will move. Nothing will be impossible for you. I'm going to come out of the sharing my desktop. There we go. So as we look at that verse, what Jesus is really talking about there is faithfulness. He's not talking about some sort of, I just have to believe hard enough. He's talking about, I have to have faithfulness as a mustard seed. We're going to go to Luke here in a minute. We'll see this a little bit more in depth with the mustard seed. But the basic idea is that how does a mustard seed have faithfulness, right? It's kind of an odd, most translations, the way that they're going to deal with it is that they're going to try and say it has to do with the size of the mustard seed. But they're adding that to the text. There's no word for size or small seed or anything like that in the text. The way the Greek reads is, if you have pistis, that is a mustard seed, and the idea is, that of having pistis or faithfulness or faith, the way in which a mustard seed has that. So the question then, well, how does a mustard seed have that, right? Well, a mustard seed it does what it's told, right? It does what it's programmed to do, right? So a mustard seed is supposed to do a certain thing. God designed the mustard seed to do a particular thing. And it starts off, and it can be small. It is very small. But it grows into one of the largest cultivated plants. And so in a garden, especially an herb garden, you plant a mustard seed and you get this big bush out of it. And in the Middle East, sometimes that it's as tall as the trees are in the Middle East. The trees aren't very tall there, but it can be as tall as a tree. So you have this concept that what Jesus is trying to say is that a mustard seed obeys what it's supposed to do. It has faithfulness to what it's supposed to do, and it can do great things because of that. And that's the message. So turn to Luke, and we'll see this a little bit more in depth. Luke chapter 17. We're going to start in verse 5. The apostles said to the Lord, increase our faith. If you have faith, and again, they're adding the word size here, the size of a mustard seed. So if you have faith as a mustard seed, the Lord said, you can say to this mulberry tree, be uprooted and planted in the sea, and it will obey you. Which one of you, having a slave, so he's going to go into a little bit more depth about what he's talking about. Why this mustard seed thing, right? What does that have to do with increasing our faith? And again, the typical translation is going to add the word size because they're not understanding what Jesus is saying. So they add the word size because the mustard seed is a very small seed. Oh, so it must be saying that if you have just even a little bit of faith, you can move mountains. And that's the way people typically teach that. And it doesn't at all say that. And in fact, that never works. People who have a little bit of faith don't move mountains. So what's it talking about? So Jesus is going to further explain this here. Which one of you, having a slave tending sheep or plowing, will say to him when he comes in from the field, "Come at once and sit down to eat"? Instead, will he not tell him, "Prepare something for me to eat, get ready, and serve me while I eat and drink. Later you can eat and drink"? Does he thank that slave because he did what was commanded? In the same way, when you have done all that you were commanded, you should say, "We are good-for-nothing slaves. We've only done our duty." Jesus is telling them how to increase their faith. The way in which you increase your pistis, this is the problem in English because we use this word faith or even the word trust, right? And Jesus is going to turn this on their head because they probably did say increase our trust, right? But Jesus is going to turn around because the same word, it's one word in Greek, whereas we have the word faith or trust and then a different word, faithfulness, and they don't exactly mean the same thing. Pistis, there's only one Greek word for these two concepts, the concept of having faith or believing or trusting something and being faithful to something, obeying and being faithful to that something are the same word in Greek. So Jesus then turns around and says, if you have faithfulness as a mustard seed, you can say to this mulberry tree, you can do great things, because that's what they're asking about, right? When they asked about the boy they couldn't cast the spirit out of, why couldn't we do it? Why can't we do the great things that you're doing, right? And so he's going to tell them how to increase their quote-unquote faith by being faithful to what God has commanded them to do, right? And so he goes on and he tells them, how do you increase your faith? Well, you be faithful. You be a servant and do exactly what your master says. And then you can move mountains, right? So the idea is if you decide, and I believe as hard as I want to, that I'm going to move that mountain, that will never, ever happen. Not in 100 million years will that ever happen. But if I'm faithful to God and to Jesus Christ, and I'm obedient, and I'm just a servant, and what do you want me to do? And they tell me what they want me to do, and then I do it. If God comes along and he says, I want you to say to that mountain, move it over there, now I can say, you mountain, move over there, and it will move, unquestionably. So that's what Jesus is telling us with this mustard seed comparison, is the mustard seed just does what it's supposed to do. And if we do what we're supposed to do in obedience and faithfulness to God, we can move mountains. So what I want to do is I want to take just a quick look at what are we supposed to do, right? What is God's commandment to us? And we can have specific words. We see this in, we won't go there, but in Romans 10:17, it says that faith comes by hearing, and hearing a message from Christ. And so in that, the word message there it's the word for word that means a spoken word. So if Jesus comes along or God comes along and tells you something, now you can have faith in that thing, right? So for example, healing is a really good example of this. I want to heal a particular person, right? Maybe I want to heal Lisa from this tear that she's got, right? And I just want to command healing. Well, if the Lord hasn't told me, you know what? You go tell Lisa that she's healed in my name. If he hasn't done that, then I can do that till I'm blue in the face and nothing's going to happen, right? It's not until Jesus has direction from God to do that thing that it's going to happen. And when Jesus tells me, go do that thing, then I can go make that happen. Now, if I do it enough times, what's the old saying? Even a blind squirrel can find a nut now and again, right? If I command healing enough times, there will be some times when Jesus is actually doing that thing. And so it will seem to work, right? So maybe once out of every 25 times bam, that person gets miraculously healed. And so I'm thinking, I just need to have more faith. I need to, because I had enough faith that time. No, that's not how it works. Faith comes from hearing from God and him telling you what to do and then being obedient to that. So we can certainly say we want to listen to God, and we want to hear his voice, and we want to listen to Jesus and be his servant and get his direction, and then we can move mountains doing that. But he has given us an overarching commandment that we can know if we are in obedience to this, we will move mountains in people's lives, figuratively speaking. Look at John chapter 14. And the name of the game is love. That is our commandment. We'll look at several verses here along those lines. John chapter 14, starting in verse 12, it says, I assure you, the one who believes in me will also do the works that I do, and he will do even greater works than these, because I am going to the Father. Whatever you ask in my name, I will do it, so that the Father may be glorified in the Son. If you ask me anything in my name, I will do it. If you love me, you will keep my commands. Flip over to John chapter 15. So we see Jesus is saying here, he's telling us, we're going to do great things, and we can go to him and ask for stuff, and he's going to do stuff for us. But he's saying that that we need to love him, and we do that by keeping his commandments. In John 15, starting in verse 1, it says, Jesus says, I am the true vine, and my Father is the vineyard keeper. Every branch in me that does not produce fruit, he removes, and he prunes every branch that produces fruit so that it will produce more fruit. You are already clean because of the word I have spoken to you. Remain in me, and I in you. This is talking about faithfulness. Just as a branch is unable to produce fruit by itself unless it remains on the vine, so neither can you unless you remain in me. If the branch does not remain faithful to the vine, if it becomes separated from the vine, it's not going to produce fruit. And in the same way, we have to be faithful to Christ, and then we can produce a lot of fruit. It says, if anyone does not remain in me, he is thrown aside like a branch and he withers. We can't produce fruit if we are not faithful to Christ. They gather them, throw them into the fire, and they are burned. If you remain in me and my word remains in you, ask whatever you want, and it will be done for you. If I remain faithful to him, he's going to be doing things for me that I'm asking for. That's what Jesus is saying here. If I'm faithful to him, if I'm doing the things that he's commanded me to do, then I'm going to be able to ask him for things, and he's going to do those things for me. That's how it actually works. My Father is glorified by this, that you produce much fruit and prove to be my disciples. As the Father has loved me, I have also loved you. Remain in my love. If you keep my commands, you will remain in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commands and remain in his love. I have spoken these things to you so that my joy may be in you and your joy may be complete. This is my command. Love one another as I have loved you. So we can know that if we want to produce fruit, if we want to see those mountains moved, that the way to do that is to be an obedient servant. And that our primary command as servants of God is to love people, to love one another especially, but to love everybody in general, right? And that the more and more we love one another, the more faithful we are to Christ, and the more we will see those mountains move, the more we'll hear those words, yes, go ahead and do that, and it will happen. Right? And that just makes sense if you think about it. If my focus is on loving somebody else, it's not about me. I'm not thinking about myself. I'm just being a servant. It's part of what Jesus is talking about in Luke, is that the disciples were constantly being buffeted up with pride, and they wanted to be the greatest in the kingdom. And Jesus is telling them, no, be the greatest servant. Have the mindset of a slave who says, I'm just doing what I'm told, right? Think about it. That's exactly what Jesus said to them. He said, I don't do anything of my own accord. I'm only doing what the Father tells me to do, right? And that's the kind of mindset that we want to have. And the primary way in which we do that is to love one another. Look at 2 John chapter 1. 2 John chapter 1, verse 6 says, and this is love, that we walk according to his commands. This is the command, as you have heard it from the beginning, you must walk in love. So our commandment, first and foremost, is to walk in love, to love one another, to love people. And as we walk in love, as we obey that commandment, and our focus is on other people, to love them and to care for them, and from our own perspective, just to be a servant of God, to not be thinking constantly about what am I going to get out of this, whatever, but rather I'm thinking, what can I do on behalf of the Lord Jesus Christ for other people? What can I do for them and love them? Then I'm going to be hearing from Christ, and I'm going to be doing the things that he's telling me to do because I'm abiding in him, and he said he would do that, right? So last one thing I want to say, and then Lisa's got her hand up, so we'll get to you here in a second, Lisa. That love, in our lives, love should become as automatic as obedience is to a slave, right? That, a faithful servant, a faithful slave, obedience was just automatic. The master says, do this, they did that, whatever that was. And love for us should be that automatic. We should be obedient to it. It should be like it was programmed into us, like the mustard seed is programmed to grow into a mustard bush. We should be like that. That just like the mustard seed is not going to do anything else but grow into that big mustard bush, we should be programmed to love automatically all the time. That's automatically what we're going to do, so that it becomes like the mustard seed. Our faithfulness to love is as automatic as a seed growing into a plant. All right, so that's what I have to say about that. Lisa, you got your hand up.
Well, I just think it was so interesting where you started this morning, because Les and I had a conversation about that very verse yesterday. We were talking, if I can go down a rabbit trail for just a minute, we were talking about an organization we support that I just got this letter from because they've been around for 15 years. And years and years ago, I got a book from my library called The Price of Stones by a man named Twissa J. Jackson Kaguri. He's later changed the name of the book to A School for My Village, if anybody wants to read it. But I think most libraries have it as The Price of Stones. And the reason it meant so much to me is because I read this book, and when I was done with the book, I'm like, man, they have to be online somewhere. I have to be part of this. I have to be part of making this happen. And what so inspired me about the book, it's about a guy who he's very, very poor, comes from the village of Nyaka in Uganda, and he goes through a lot in trying to get educated. He comes to America, is going to school, eventually marries a woman who's in med school. And the other side of the story is that Uganda is going through a huge AIDS crisis. Many, many people are dying. Many, many grandmothers are supporting not only their own children, but many other people's children. And as he goes, he takes his wife back to visit his village after his brothers died of AIDS. And there's these children there that they don't have a school. They're living in poverty. And he's talking to his wife about how somebody should do something. Like at some point he wants to come back and make a difference. And she says, why not now? They had saved $5,000 to buy a house. I believe she might have been pregnant at the time. And what they did is he convinces his dad, who doesn't give a crap about the kids, to give up a little piece of his land, and he gathers these stones together literally and builds a one-room schoolhouse and finances a school for these kids. What so inspires me about the book, though, is that he has a few kids that he helps. Then he has a few more kids. Then kids find out about it and they start walking in from miles away to come, and he has to figure out how to support them. And then his kids are getting sick because the water in the community is bad. And then he meets somebody by chance who has a system that's very cost effective that allows the community to have clean water for very little money, so that his kids and the entire community are no longer getting sick from the water. Then he has a commitment to his kids that if they'll study, that he will find a way to get them to college so that he can change his country, because poverty is so profound. And so the whole book is about how each time something happens, God is there, and he's Christian, but he takes every kid, doesn't care what their faith or whatever, but he's a Christian. And so the whole book is just about one thing and then another thing and then another thing. And now it's 15 years later, and he has two, CNN, maybe 5 years ago, nominated him as one of the philanthropists in the country which really upped their donations because it gave them a lot more, exposure. And now they have 2 primary schools, and his third group of kids is going through college. And they've actually there's one kid here who's going to school in the U.S. And what I love about the book, and what Les and I conversation when I was looking at this piece of mail yesterday, he said, when he started, he couldn't, it's like the mustard seed. It's like that. What I said to Les is, that man has moved mountains. I mean, from nothing, he has moved mountains. And I said, damn it, I think I finally get what that means. Because if you looked at the mountain, you would say, I could never do that. I could never do that. Like it's too big for me. I'm just a guy. And he started with a mustard seed. And then with every step along the way, he moved a mountain. And to me, it made those verses more real and alive, and I understood it, because you could stand, like you said, you could stand in front of the mountain your whole life and go move, 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 and nothing happens. Or sometimes, I know myself, I don't do anything because it seems too big for me. And what I learned from the book and what I loved about the book is just that if you do something, then the next thing comes. And before you know it, you have moved a mountain. And I think that's what you were saying today about love and faith and faithfulness.
Yeah, that's really good.
The thing is that you can't move a mountain until God tells you can move the mountain. But the message there that Jesus is telling us is that the way in which these things happen, whether it's casting out a spirit or moving a mountain or whatever, is by being obedient as a servant. And so we already know what our main commandment is as servants, and that is to love one another. So we don't have to have a word from the Lord to go do that, right? We don't have to have some sort of special revelation to know that what I should be doing all the time is loving other people, right? But then what happens is, like you were talking about, Lisa, is that as I'm faithful to serve in that way, to obey that commandment, the Lord will start giving me things. And as I'm faithful to those things, and there's a whole principle in this, I didn't put this into the teaching, but where Jesus talks about that he who is faithful in little will be given much, will be faithful in much, and he who is unfaithful in little will be unfaithful in much. So the way that it works with God is he's going to give you a little bit, and if you're faithful in that, he's going to give you more. And if you're faithful in that, he's going to give you more than that. And so we know if we're just faithful to the first commandment, this one that's given to all of us, which is to love one another, then we'll have more added to that we'll see happen. And we will receive, the direction in turn, whether that's building a schoolhouse to teach children, or casting a demon out of one, or healing somebody, or starting a church, or God showing us to go witness to a particular person. We just need to remember that all of the time we need to love and be obedient to that. And then as we're faithful to that, we'll get more and more and more things to be faithful to. Anybody else have a comment or question or?
Good teaching, John.
Thank you. I was going to say, John, I think it's really interesting. I didn't know that everybody uses that size of a mustard seed on like frames and signs for their house and decorations and all that kind of stuff. And I guess I never knew that word really wasn't supposed to be there. That's pretty cool.
That's not supposed to be there.
The word size, when it says the size of a mustard seed, that's not the point that Jesus is making. And in fact, once you incorporate in Luke, you see it's kind of the opposite. That, if you want to have the kind of faith that can move mountains, then you need to be the ultimate servant, right? And so you're just doing exactly what you're told to do. Mm-hmm. Well, the way people typically think of this concept of having faith as the size of a mustard seed is, I have to build up enough faith to make the thing happen that I want it to happen. That's the way that this gets treated. And which Jesus, again, he's saying the opposite of that. You don't go and do what you decided to do and just build up enough faith to make that happen. You do what you're told to do, right? And because it's God we're talking about, it will happen.
But I never could understand that. That never made sense to me anyway, because I think about it in terms of faith like a mustard seed, like the size of a mustard seed. People would say, well, you just need to have a little tiny bit of faith. And I'm like, what's a little bit of tiny bit of faith? Either you have faith, you trust and you believe, or you don't. There's not really a little tiny amount, and then there's a whole big amount. I mean, it just makes it incomprehensible to think about it in that way, to me.
Yeah. And, the thing is that if we will just keep in mind that we have this commandment at a base level to love one another, we always can know what to do. That love, that's what we need. First and foremost, forget everything else, we need to love. And if we just do that over and over and over again, loving other people, finding ways to love them as opposed to finding ways to get what I want, then we'll be doing what he wants us to do. It's not.
Yeah, love, and then if the Lord has instruction or advice or something regarding that, to obey it, to follow that. Yeah, this has been I know that this has kind of been a recent, like in the last 2 or 3 years, that a lot more understanding has started to happen about that particular parable and subject, and I really like that a lot. I always feel very it's a good feeling to understand finally something that just nothing really clicked and you really couldn't understand it. And that's how it was for me, trying to understand that parable according to common teachings on it.
Yeah. Dave and Carol got their hand up.
Yeah, John, I thought it was really interesting about you covering the size aspect of faithfulness, or because somewhere in the scripture it says that one of the examples for that seed is supposed to be the smallest seed ever. And I've heard a person who was trying to, disparage the word, showing how stupid or unscientific it was, because he says that the mustard seed isn't the smallest seed. So Jesus didn't know what he was talking about. And so, so throw your Bible away because Jesus didn't know what he was talking about. And it's interesting to learn that this mustard seed, the size isn't being talked about at all. And so this guy is standing on very loose, sandy soil.
Yeah, and there's two other things about that particular notion too. One is that in the particular words that are being used in the underlying Greek, Jesus is referring to plants in a garden, not to plants in general. And
right.
cultivated Middle Eastern plants, the black mustard seed is the smallest seed.
That's how it was defended by someone else. But it's nice to learn that size is not even being talked about, really. So you just throw the whole argument out.
It's not even referenced at all, size.
That word size there, as small as, you'll see it this way, as small as a mustard seed. Sometimes it'll be translated that way. The word small is not there. Now, when you're talking about faith, the word little or small is there. So when it says that if you, well, let me go back to it real quick. Oh, we have that verse up. Matthew 17:20, where it says, when they say, why couldn't we drive it out? And he says, because of your little faith, of your little, lack, small, whatever. He's talking about the lack of their faithfulness.
Right.
Again, we see over and over again, even amongst these disciples that Jesus has chosen, and we think of these guys as being the faithful ones because everybody else is either not believing him to begin with or leaves after the teaching gets too hard, and they hang around. They're still not getting the main message, because even the night that Jesus is taken, they're still arguing about which of them is going to be the greatest in the kingdom, right? Even that night, they're still arguing about that. They're arguing about it when they come into Jerusalem. And so even though he's been telling them this over and over and over again, they're still not getting it. I think it's one of the reasons why you get in the book of John, the bulk of the book of John is the discourse that Jesus gave to them on the night that he was taken. And it's a very, very long section of John is all about that. And much of that is about that subject. And, and then it's not in John, but in the midst of that is when he washes their feet. And so, he's even illustrating the message to them, to be a servant. Stop focusing on yourself and what you're going to get and how good you look and how important you're going to be. Get out of yourself and put the focus on loving other people.
Yeah, it was the lowliest of the servant's job, is to wash guests' feet.
Yeah. Tell you what, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording there.